Chapter 29 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 29. The Next Morning. Arthur did not pass a sleepless night. He slept long and well, for sleep comes to the perplexed, if the perplexed are only weary enough. But at 7 he rang his bell and astonished Pym by declaring he was going to get up and must have breakfast brought to him at 8. "And see that my mare is saddled at 8:30, and tell my grandfather when he's down that I'm better this morning and am gone for a ride." He had been awake an hour and could rest in bed no longer. In bed our yesterdays are too oppressive. If a man can only get up, though it be but to whistle or to smoke, he has a present which offers some resistance to the past, sensations which assert themselves against tyrannous memories. And if there were such a thing as taking averages of feeling, it would certainly be found that in the hunting and shooting seasons regret, self-reproach, and mortified pride weigh lighter on country gentlemen than in late spring and summer. Arthur felt he should be more of a man on horseback. Even the presence of Pym, waiting on him with the usual deference, was a reassurance to him after the scenes of yesterday. For, with Arthur's sensitiveness to opinion, the loss of Adam's respect was a shock to his self-contentment which suffused his imagination with the sense he had sunk in all eyes, as a sudden shock of fear from some real peril makes a nervous woman afraid even to step, because all her perceptions are suffused with a sense of danger. Arthur's, as you know, was a loving nature. Deeds of kindness were as easy to him as a bad habit. They were the common issue of his weakness and good qualities, of his egoism and his sympathy. He didn't like to witness pain, and he liked to have grateful eyes beaming on him as the giver of pleasure. When he was a lad of 7, he one day kicked down an old gardener's pitcher of broth, from no motive but a kicking impulse, not reflecting that it was the old man's dinner. But on learning that sad fact, he took his favourite pencil case and a silver-hafted knife out of his pocket and offered them as compensation. He had been the same Arthur ever since, trying to make all offences forgotten in benefits. If there were any bitterness in his nature, it could only show itself against the man who refused to be conciliated by him. And perhaps the time was come for some of that bitterness to rise. At the first moment Arthur had felt pure distress and self-reproach at discovering that Adam's happiness was involved in his relation to Hetty. If there had been a possibility of making Adam tenfold amends, if deeds of gift or other deeds could have restored Adam's contentment and regard for him as a benefactor, Arthur would not only have executed them without hesitation, but would have felt bound all the more closely to Adam, and would never have been weary of making retribution. But Adam could receive no amends, his suffering could not be cancelled, his respect and affection could not be recovered by any prompt deeds of atonement. He stood like an immovable obstacle against which no pressure could avail, an embodiment of what Arthur most shrank from believing in, the irrevocableness of his own wrongdoing. The words of scorn, the refusal to shake hands, the mastery asserted over him in their last conversation in the hermitage, above all, the sense of having been knocked down, to which a man does not very well reconcile himself, even under the most heroic circumstances, pressed on him with a galling pain which was stronger than compunction. Arthur would so gladly have persuaded himself that he had done no harm, and if no one had told him to the contrary, he could have persuaded himself so much better. Nemesis can seldom forge a sword for herself out of our consciences, out of the suffering we feel in the suffering we may have caused. There is rarely metal enough there to make an effective weapon. Our moral sense learns the manners of good society and smiles when others smile. But when some rude person gives rough names to our actions, she is apt to take part against us. And so it was with Arthur. Adam's judgment of him, Adam's grating words, disturbed his self-soothing arguments. Not that Arthur had been at ease before Adam's discovery. Struggles and resolves had transformed themselves into compunction and anxiety. He was distressed for Hetty's sake, and distressed for his own, that he must leave her behind. He had always, both in making and breaking resolutions, looked beyond his passion and seen that it must speedily end in separation, but his nature was too ardent and tender for him not to suffer at this parting, and on Hetty's account he was filled with uneasiness. He had found out the dream in which she was living, that she was to be a lady in silks and satins, and when he had first talked to her about his going away, she had asked him tremblingly to let her go with him and be married. It was his painful knowledge of this which had given the most exasperating sting to Adam's reproaches. He had said no word with the purpose of deceiving her. Her vision was all spun by her own childish fancy, but he was obliged to confess to himself that it was spun half out of his own actions. And to increase the mischief, on this last evening he had not dared to hint the truth to Hetty. He had been obliged to soothe her with tender, hopeful words, lest he should throw her into violent distress. He felt the situation acutely, felt the sorrow of the dear thing in the present, and thought with a darker anxiety of the tenacity which her feelings might have in the future. There was one sharp point which pressed against him. Every other he could evade by hopeful self-persuasion. The whole thing had been secret. The Poysers had not the shadow of a suspicion. No one, except Adam, knew anything of what had passed. No one else was likely to know. For Adam had impressed on Hetty that it would be fatal to betray, by word or look, that there had been the least intimacy between them, and Adam, who knew half their secret, would rather help them keep it than betray it. It was an unfortunate business altogether, but there was no use in making it worse than it was by imaginary exaggerations and forebodings of evil that might never come. The temporary sadness for Hetty was the worst consequence. He resolutely turned away his eyes from any bad consequence that was not demonstratively inevitable. But Hetty might have had the trouble in some other way, if not in this, and perhaps hereafter he might be able to do a great deal for her, and make up for all the tears she would shed about him. She would owe the advantage of his care for her in future years to the sorrow she had incurred now. So good comes out of evil. Such is the beautiful arrangement of things. Are you inclined to ask whether this can be the same Arthur who, 2 months ago, had that freshness of feeling, that delicate honour which shrinks from wounding even a sentiment, and does not contemplate any more positive offences as possible for it, who thought his own self-respect was a higher tribunal than any external opinion? The same, I assure you, only under different conditions. Our deeds determine us as much as we determine our deeds, and until we know what has been or will be the peculiar combination of outward with inward facts which constitutes a man's critical actions, it will be better not to think ourselves wise about his character. There is a terrible coercion in our deeds, which may first turn the honest man into a deceiver, and then reconcile him to the change, for this reason, that the second wrong presents itself to him in the guise of the only practicable right. The action which before commission had been seen with that blended common sense and fresh untarnished feeling which is the healthy eye of the soul, is looked at afterwards with the lens of apologetic ingenuity, through which all things that men call beautiful and ugly are seen to be made up of textures very much alike. Europe adjusts itself to the fait accompli, and so does an individual character, till the placid adjustment is disturbed by a convulsive retribution. No man can escape this vitiating effect of an offence against his own sentiment of right, and the effect was the stronger in Arthur because of that very need of self-respect which, while his conscience was still at ease, was one of his best safeguards. Self-accusation was too painful to him. He could not face it. He must persuade himself that he had not been very much to blame. He began even to pity himself for the necessity he was under of deceiving Adam. It was a course so opposed to the honesty of his own nature. But then it was the only right thing to do. Well, whatever had been amiss in him, he was miserable enough in consequence. miserable about Hetty, miserable about this letter he had promised to write, and it seemed at one moment to be a gross barbarity, at the other perhaps the greatest kindness he could do to her. And across all this reflection would dart every now and then a sudden impulse of passionate defiance towards all consequences. He would carry Hetty away, and all other considerations might go to... In this state of mind the four walls of his room made an intolerable prison to him. They seemed to hem in and press down upon him all the crowd of contradictory thoughts and conflicting feelings, some of which would fly away in the open air. He had only an hour or two to make up his mind in, and he must get clear and calm. Once on Meg's back, in the fresh air of that fine morning, he would be more master of the situation. The pretty creature arched her bay neck in the sunshine, and pawed the gravel, and trembled with pleasure when her master stroked her nose, and patted her, and talked to her even in a more caressing tone than usual. He loved her the better because she knew nothing of his secrets, but Meg was quite as well acquainted with her master's mental state as many others of her sex with mental condition of that nice young gentleman towards whom their hearts are in a state of fluttering expectation. Arthur cantered for 5 miles beyond the Chase, till he was at the foot of a hill where there were no hedges or trees to hem in the road. Then he threw the bridle on Meg's neck and prepared to make up his mind. Hetty knew that their meeting yesterday must be the last before Arthur went away. There was no possibility of their contriving another without exciting suspicion, and she was like a frightened child, unable to think of anything, only able to cry at the mention of parting, and then put her face up to have the tears kissed away. He could do nothing but comfort her, and lull her into dreaming on. A letter would be a dreadfully abrupt way of awakening her. Yet there was truth in what Adam said, that would save her from a lengthened delusion, which might be worse than a sharp immediate pain, and it was the only way of satisfying Adam, who must be satisfied for more reasons than one. If he could have seen her again... But that was impossible. There was such a thorny hedge of hindrances between them, and imprudence would be fatal. And yet, if he could see her again, what good would it do? Only cause him to suffer more from the sight of her distress and the remembrance of it. Away from him she was surrounded by all the motives to self-control. A sudden dread here fell like a shadow across his imagination, the dread lest she should do something violent in her grief. And close upon that dread came another, which deepened the shadow. But he shook them off with the force of youth and hope. What was the ground for painting the future in that dark way? It was just as likely to be reverse. Arthur told himself he did not deserve that things should turn out badly. He had never meant beforehand to do anything his conscience disapproved. He had been led on by circumstances. There was a sort of implicit confidence in him that he was really such a good fellow at bottom, Providence would not treat him harshly. At all events, he couldn't help what would come now. All he could do was to take what seemed the best course at the present moment. And he persuaded himself that that course was to make the way open between Adam and Hetty. Her heart might really turn to Adam, as he said, after a while, and in that case there would have been no great harm done, since it was still Adam's ardent wish to make her his wife. To be sure, Adam was deceived in a way that Arthur would have resented as a deep wrong if it had been practised on himself. That was a reflection that marred the consoling prospect. Arthur's cheeks even burned in mingled shame and irritation at the thought. But what could a man do in such dilemma? He was bound in honour to say no word that could injure Hetty. His first duty was to guard her. He would never have told or acted a lie on his own account. Good God, what a miserable fool he was to have brought himself into such a dilemma! And yet, if ever man had excuses, he had. Pity that consequences are determined not by excuses, but by actions. Well, the letter must be written. It was the only means that promised the solution of the difficulty. The tears came into Arthur's eyes as he thought of Hetty reading it, but it would be almost as hard for him to write it. He was not doing anything easy to himself, and this last thought helped him to arrive at a conclusion. He could never deliberately have taken a step which inflicted pain on another and left himself at ease. Even a moment of jealousy at the thought of giving up Hetty to Adam went to convince him that he was making a sacrifice. When once he had come to this conclusion, he turned Meg round and set off home in a canter. The letter should be written the first thing, and the rest of the day would be filled with other business. He should have no time to look behind him. Happily, Irwine and Gawain were coming to dinner, and by 12 o'clock the next day he should have left the chase miles behind him. There was some security in this constant occupation against an uncontrollable impulse seizing on him to rush to Hetty and thrust into her hands some mad proposition that would undo everything. Faster and faster went the sensitive Meg, at every slight sign from her rider, till the canter had passed into a swift gallop. "I thought they said the master was took ill last night," said sour old John, the groom, at dinner time in the servants' hall. "He's been riding fit to split the mare in two this forenoon." "That's happen one of the symptoms, John," said the facetious coachman. "Then I wish he were let blood for't, that's all," said John grimly. Adam had been early at the chase to know how Arthur was, and had been relieved from all anxiety about the effects of his blow by learning that he was gone out for a ride. At 5 o'clock he was punctually there again, and sent up word of his arrival. In a few minutes Pym came down with a letter in his hand and gave it to Adam, saying that the captain was too busy to see him and had written everything he had to say. The letter was directed to Adam, but he went out of doors again before opening it. It contained a sealed enclosure directed to Hetty. On the inside of the cover Adam read: "In the enclosed letter I have written everything you wish. I leave it to you to decide whether you will be doing best to deliver it to Hetty or to return it to me. Ask yourself once more whether you are not taking a measure which may pain her more than mere silence. There is no need for us seeing each other again now. We shall meet with better feelings some months hence. A.D." "Perhaps he's na right not to see me," thought Adam. "It's no use meeting to say more hard words, and it's no use meeting to shake hands and say we're friends again. We're not friends, and it's better not to pretend it. I know forgiveness is a man's duty, but to my thinking that can only mean as you're giving up all thoughts of taking revenge. It can never mean as though you're to have your old feelings back again, for that's not possible. He's not the same man to me, and I can't feel the same toward him. God help me, I don't know whether I feel the same towards anybody. I seem as if I'd been measuring my work from a false line, and got it all to measure over again." But the question about delivering the letter to Hetty soon absorbed Adam's thoughts. Arthur had procured some relief to himself by throwing the decision on Adam with a warning, and Adam, who was not given to hesitation, hesitated here. He determined to feel his way, to ascertain as well as he could what was Hetty's state of mind before he decided on delivering the letter. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laurie Heinrichs. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 30. The Delivery of the Letter. The next Sunday Adam joined the Poysers on their way out of church, hoping for an invitation to go home with them. He had the letter in his pocket and was anxious to have an opportunity of talking to Hetty alone. He could not see her face at church, for she had changed her seat, and when he came up to shake her hands, her manner was doubtful and constrained. He expected this, for it was the first time she had met him since she had been aware that he had seen her with Arthur in the grove. "Come, you'll go on with us, Adam," Mr. Poyser said when they reached the turning, and as soon as they were in the fields Adam ventured to offer his arm to Hetty. The children soon gave them an opportunity of lingering behind a little, and then Adam said, "Will you contrive for me to walk out in the garden a bit with you this evening, if it keeps fine, Hetty? I've something particular to talk to you about." Hetty said very well. She was really as anxious as Adam was that she should have some private talk with him. She wondered what he thought of her and Arthur. He must have seen them kissing, she knew, but she had no conception of the scene that had taken place between Arthur and Adam. Her first feeling had been that Adam would be very angry with her, and perhaps would tell her aunt and uncle, but it never entered her mind that he would dare to say anything to Captain Donnithorne. It was a relief to her that he behaved so kindly to her to-day, and wanted to speak to her alone, for she had trembled when she found he was going home with them, lest he should mean to tell. But now he wanted to talk to her by herself. She should learn what he thought and what he meant to do. She felt a certain confidence that she could persuade him not to do anything she did not want him to do. She could perhaps even make him believe that she didn't care for Arthur, and as long as Adam thought that there was any hope of her having him, he would do just what she liked, she knew. Besides, she must go on seeming to encourage Adam, lest her uncle and aunt should be angry and suspect her of having some secret lover. Hetty's little brain was busy with this combination as she hung on Adam's arm and said yes or no to some slight observations of his about the many hawthorn berries there would be for the birds this next winter, and the low-hanging clouds that would hardly hold up to morning. And when they rejoined her aunt and uncle, she could pursue her thoughts without interruption, for Mr. Poyser held that though a young man might like to have the woman he was courting on his arm, he would nevertheless be glad of a little reasonable talk about business the while. And, for his own part, he was curious to hear the most recent news about the Chase farm. So, through the rest of the walk, he claimed Adam's conversation for himself, and Hetty laid her small plots and imagined her little scenes of cunning blandishment, as she walked along the hedgerows on honest Adam's arm, quite as well as if she had been an elegantly clad coquette alone in her boudoir. For if a country beauty in clumsy shoes be only shallow-hearted enough, it is astonishing how closely her mental processes may resemble those of a lady in society and crinoline, who applies her refined intellect to the problem of committing indiscretions without compromising herself. Perhaps the resemblance was not much the less because Hetty felt very unhappy all the while. The parting with Arthur was a double pain to her. Mingling with the tumult of passion and vanity there was the dim, undefined fear that the future might shape itself in some way quite unlike her dream. She clung to the comforting, hopeful words Arthur had uttered in their last meeting. "I shall come again at Christmas time, and then we will see what can be done." She clung to the belief that he was so fond of her he would never be happy without her, and she still hugged her secret, that a great gentleman loved her, with gratified pride, as a superiority over all the girls she knew. But the uncertainty of the future, the possibilities to which she could give no shape, began to press upon her like the invisible weight of air. She was alone on her little island of dreams, and all around her was the dark, unknown water where Arthur was gone. She could gather no elation of spirits now by looking forward, but only by looking backward to build confidence on past words and caresses. But occasionally, since Thursday evening, her dim anxieties had been almost lost behind the more definite fear that Adam might betray what he knew to her uncle and aunt, and his sudden proposition to talk with her alone had set her thoughts to work in a new way. She was eager not to lose this evening's opportunity, and after tea, when the boys were going into the garden and Toddy begged to go with them, Hetty said with alacrity that surprised Mrs. Poyser, "I'll go with her, aunt." It did not seem at all surprising that Adam said he would go too, and soon he and Hetty were left alone together on the walk by the filbert trees, where the boys were busy elsewhere gathering the large unripe nuts to play at cobnut with, and Toddy was watching them with a puppy-like air of contemplation. It was but a short time, hardly 2 months, since Adam had had his mind filled with delicious hopes as he stood by Hetty's side in this garden. The remembrance of that scene had often been with him since Thursday evening, the sunlight through the apple-tree boughs, the red bunches, Hetty's sweet blush. It came importantly now on this sad evening with the low-hanging clouds, but he tried to suppress it, lest some emotion should impel him to say more than was needful for Hetty's sake. "After what I saw on Thursday night, Hetty," he began, "you won't think me making too free in what I'm going to say. If you was being courted by any man as 'ud make you his wife, and I known you was fond of him and meant to have him, I should have no right to speak a word to you about it. But when I see you're being made love to by a gentleman as can never marry you, and doesna think o' marrying you, I feel bound to interfere for you. I can't speak about it to them as are i' the place o' your parents, for that might bring worse trouble than's needful." Adam's words relieved one of Hetty's fears, but they also carried a meaning which sickened her with a strengthened foreboding. She was pale and trembling, and yet she would have angrily contradicted Adam if she had dared to betray her feelings. But she was silent. "You're so young, you know, Hetty," he went on, almost tenderly, "and you haven't seen much of what goes on in the world. It's right for me to do what I can to save you from getting into the trouble for want o' your knowing where you're being led to. If anybody besides me knew what I know about your meeting a gentleman and having fine presents from him, they'd speak light on you, and you'd lose your character. And besides that, you'll have to suffer in your feelings with giving your love to a man as can never marry you, so as he might take care of you all your life." Adam paused and looked at Hetty, who was plucking the leaves from the filbert trees and tearing them up in her hand. Her little plans and preconcerted speeches had all forsaken her, like an ill-learnt lesson, under the terrible agitation produced by Adam's words. There was a cruel force in their calm certainty, which threatened to grapple and crush her flimsy hopes and fancies. She wanted to resist them, she wanted to throw them off with angry contradictions, but the determination to conceal what she felt still governed her. It was nothing more than a blind prompting now, for she was unable to calculate the effect of her words. "You've no right to say as I love him," she said faintly, but impetuously, plucking another rough leaf and tearing it up. She was very beautiful in her paleness and agitation, with her dark, childish eyes dilated and her breath shorter than usual. Adam's heart yearned over her as he looked at her, and if he could but comfort her and soothe her and save her from this pain, if he had but some sort of strength that would enable him to rescue her poor troubled mind as he would have rescued her body in the face of all danger. "I doubt it must be so, Hetty," he said tenderly, "for I canna believe you'd let any man kiss you by yourselves, and give you a gold box with his hair, and go a walking i' the grove to meet him, if you didna love him. I'm not blaming you, for I know it 'ud begun by little and little, till at last you'd not be able to throw it off. It's him I blame for stealing your love in that way, when he knew he could never make you the right amends. He's been trifling with you, and making a plaything of you, and caring nothing about you as a man ought to care." "Yes, he does care for me. I know better nor you," Hetty burst out. Everything was forgotten but the pain and anger she felt at Adam's words. "Nay, Hetty," said Adam, "if he'd cared for you rightly, he'd never have behaved so. He told me himself he meant nothing by his kissing and presents, and he wanted to make me believe as you thought little of him too. But I know better nor that. I can't help thinking as you've been trusting to his loving you well enough to marry you, for all he's a gentleman. And that's why I must speak to you about it, Hetty, for fear you should be deceiving yourself. It's never entered his head the thought of marrying you." "How do you know? How durst you say so?" said Hetty, pausing in her walk and trembling. The terrible decision of Adam's tone shook her with fear. She had no presence of mind left for the reflection that Arthur would have his reasons for not telling the truth to Adam. Her words and look were enough to determine Adam. He must give her the letter. "Perhaps you can't believe me, Hetty, because you think too well of him, because you think he loves you better than he does. But I've got a letter in my pocket as he wrote himself for me to give you. I've not read the letter, but he says he's told you the truth in it. But before I give you the letter, consider, Hetty, and don't let it take too much hold on you. It wouldn't ha' been good for him if he'd wanted to do such a mad thing as marry you. It had led to no happiness in the end." Hetty said nothing. She felt a revival of hope at the mention of a letter which Adam had not read. There would be something quite different in it from what he thought. Adam took out the letter, but he held it in his hand still, while he said in a tone of tender entreaty, "Don't you bear me ill will, Hetty, because I'm the means of bringing you this pain. God knows I'd ha' borne a good deal worse for the sake of sparing you. And think, there's nobody but me that knows about this, and I'll take care of you as if I was your brother. You're the same as ever to me, for I don't believe you've done any wrong knowingly." Hetty had laid her hand on the letter, but Adam did not loose it till he had done speaking. She took no notice of what he said. She had not listened, but he loosed the letter. She put it into her pocket without opening it, and then began to walk more quickly as if she wanted to go in. "You're in the right not to read it just yet," said Adam. "Read it when you're by yourself, but stay out a little bit longer, and let us call the children. You look so white and ill, your aunt may take notice of it." Hetty heard the warning. It recalled to her the necessity of rallying her native powers of concealment, which had half given way under the shock of Adam's words. And she had the letter in her pocket. She was sure there was comfort in that letter in spite of Adam. She ran to find Totty, and soon reappeared with recovered colour, leading Totty, who was making a sour face because she had been obliged to throw away an unripe apple that she had set her small teeth in. "Hit, Totty," said Adam. "Come and ride on my shoulder ever so high. You'll touch the tops of the trees." What little child ever refused to be comforted by that glorious sense of being seized strongly and swung upward? I don't believe Ganymede cried when the eagle carried him away, and perhaps deposited him on Jove's shoulder at the end. Totty smiled down and complacently from her secure height, and pleasant was the sight of the mother's eyes as she stood at the house door and saw Adam coming with his small burden. "Bless your sweet face, my pet," she said, the mother's strong love filling her keen eyes with mildness, as Totty leaned forward and put out her arms. She had no eyes for Hetty at that moment, and only said, without looking at her, "You go and draw some ale, Hetty. The gells are both at the cheese." After the ale had been drawn and her uncle's pipe lighted, there was Totty to be taken to bed, and brought down again in her nightgown because she would cry instead of going to sleep. Then there was supper to be got ready, and Hetty must be continually in the way to give help. Adam stayed till he knew Mrs. Poyser expected him to go, engaging her and her husband in talk as constantly as he could, for the sake of leaving Hetty more at ease. He lingered because he wanted to see her safely through that evening, and he was delighted to find how much self-command she showed. He knew she had not time to read the letter, but he did not know she was buoyed by a secret hope that the letter would contradict everything he had said. It was hard work for him to leave her, hard to think that he should not know for days how she was bearing her trouble. But he must go at last, and all he could do was press her hand gently as he said good-bye, and hope she would take that as a sign that if his love could ever be a refuge for her, it was there the same as ever. How busy his thoughts were as he walked home in devising pitying excuses for her folly, and referring all her weakness to the sweet lovingness of her nature, and blaming Arthur, with less and less inclination to admit that his conduct might be extenuated too. His exasperation at Hetty's suffering, and also at the sense that she was possibly thrust for ever out of his own reach, deafened him to any plea for the miscalled friend who had wrought this misery. Adam was a clear-sighted, fair-minded man, a fine fellow indeed, morally as well as physically, but if Aristides the Just was ever in love and jealous, he was at that moment not perfectly magnanimous, and I cannot pretend that Adam, in these painful days, felt nothing but righteous indignation and loving pity. He was bitterly jealous, and in proportion as his love made him indulgent in his judgment of Hetty, the bitterness found a vent in his feelings toward Arthur. Her head was always like to be turned, he thought, when a gentleman with his fine manners and fine clothes, and his white hands in that way o' talking gentlefolks have, came about her, making up to her in a bold way as a man couldn't do that was only her equal, and it's much if she'll ever like a common man now. He could not help drawing his own hands out of his pockets and looking at them, at the hard palms and the broken fingernails. "I'm a roughish fellow altogether. I don't know, now I come to think on't, what there is much for a woman to like about me, and yet I might ha' got another wife easy enough if I hadn't set my heart on her. But it's little matter what other women think about me if she can't love me. She might ha' loved me, perhaps, as likely as any other man. There's nobody hereabouts as I'm afraid of, if he hadn't come between us. But now I shall belike be hateful to her because I'm so different to him. And yet there's no telling. She may turn round the other way when she finds he's made light of her all the while. She may come to feel the vally of a man as 'ud be thankful to be bound to her all his life. But I must put up with it whichever way it is. I've only to be thankful it's been no worse. I am not the only man that's got to do without much happiness in his life. There's many a good bit o' work done with a bad heart. It's God's will, and that's enough for us. We shouldn't know better how things ought to be than he does, I reckon, if we was to spend our lives a-puzzling. But it ha' gone better near to spoil my work for me if I'd seen her brought to sorrow and shame, and through the man as I've always been proud to think on. Since I've been spared that, I've no right to grumble. When a man's got his limbs whole, he can bear a smart cut or two." As Adam was getting over a stile at this point in his reflections, he perceived a man walking along the field before him. He knew it was Seth returning from an evening preaching, and made haste to overtake him. "I thought thee'dst be at home before me," he said, as Seth turned round to wait for him, "for I'm later than usual to-night." Well, I'm later too, for I got into talk after meetin' with John Barnes, who was lately professed himself in a state of perfection, and I'd a question to ask him about his experience. It's one of them subjects that lead you further than you'd expect. They don't lie along the straight road." They walked along together in silence 2 or 3 minutes. Adam was not inclined to enter into the subtleties of religious experience, but he was inclined to interchange a word or two of brotherly affection and confidence with Seth. That was a rare impulse in him, much as the brothers loved each other. They hardly ever spoke of personal matters, or uttered more than an allusion to their family troubles. Adam was by nature the reserved in all matter of feelings, and Seth felt a certain timidity towards his more practical brother. "Seth, lad," Adam said, putting his arm on his brother's shoulder, "hast heard anything from Dinah Morris since she went away?" "Yes," said Seth. "She told me I might write her a word after a while, how we went on, and how mother bore up under her trouble. So I wrote to her a fortnight ago, and told her about thee having a new employment, and how mother was more contented. And last Wednesday, when I called at the post at Treddles'on, I found a letter from her. I think thee'dst perhaps like to read it, but I didna say anything about it because thee'st seemed so full of other things. It's quite easy to read. She writes wonderful for a woman." Seth had drawn the letter from his pocket and held it out to Adam, who said as he took it, "Eh, lad, I've got a tough load to carry just now. Thee mustna take it ill if I'm a bit silenter and crustier nor usual. Trouble doesna make me care less for thee. I know we shall stick together to the last." "I take not ill o' thee, Adam. I know well enough what it means if thee't a bit short wi' me now and then." "There's mother opening the door to look out for us," said Adam, as they mounted the slope. "She's been sitting in the dark as usual. Well, Gyp, well, art glad to see me?" Lisbeth went in again quickly and lighted a candle, for she had heard the welcoming rustle of footsteps in the grass before Gyp's joyful bark. "Eh, my lads, the hours was ne'er so long sin' I was born as they'n been this Sunday night. What can ye both ha' been doing till this time?" "Thee shouldstna sit in the dark, mother," said Adam. "That makes the time seem longer." "Eh, what am I to do wi' burning the candle of a Sunday when there's only me, and it's sin to do a bit o' knitting? The day's long enough for me to stare o' the book as I canna read it. It 'ud be a fine way o' shortening the time to make it waste the good candle. But which on you's for having supper? Ye mun either be clemmed or full, I should think, seeing what time o' night it is." "I'm hungry, mother," said Seth, seating himself at the little table which had been spread ever since it was light. "I've had my supper," said Adam. "Here, Gyp," he added, taking some cold potato from the table and rubbing the rough grey head that looked up towards him. "Thee needstna begin the dog," said Elizabeth. "I'n fed him already. I'm not like to forget him, I reckon, when he's all o' thee I can get sight on." "Come then, Gyp," said Adam, "we'll go to bed. Good night, mother. I'm very tired." "What ails him, dost know?" Lisbeth said to Seth, when Adam was gone upstairs. "He's like as if he was struck for death this day or two, he's so cast down. I found him i' the shop this forenoon, arter thee wast gone, a-sitting and doing nothing, not so much as a book afore him." "He's a deal o' work upon him just now, mother," said Seth, "and I think he's a bit troubled in his mind. Don't you take notice of it, because it hurts him when you do. Be as kind to him as you can, mother, and don't say anything to vex him." "Eh, what dost talk o' my vexing him? And what am I like to be but kind? I'll maul him a kettle cake for breakfast in the morning." Adam, meanwhile, was reading Dinah's letter by the light of his dip candle. "Dear brother Seth, your letter lay 3 days beyond my knowing of it at the post, for I had not money enough by me to pay the carriage, this being a time of great need and sickness here, with the rains that have fallen, as if the windows of heaven were opened again, and to lay by money, from day to day, in such a time, when there are so many in present need of all things, would be a want of trust like the laying up of the manna. I speak of this because I would not have you think me slow to answer, or that I had small joy in your rejoicing at the worldly good that has befallen your brother Adam. The honour and love you bear him is nothing but meet, for God has given him great gifts, and he uses them as the patriarch Joseph did, who, when he was exalted to a place of power and trust, yet yearned with tenderness toward his parent and his younger brother. My heart is knit to your aged mother, since it was granted me to be near her in the day of trouble. Speak to her of me, and tell her I often bear her in my thoughts at the evening time, when I am sitting in the dim light as I did with her, and we held one another's hands, and I spoke the words of comfort that were given to me. Ah, that is blessed time, isn't it, Seth, when the outward light is fading, and the body is a little wearied with its work and its labour? Then the inward light shines the brighter, and we have a deeper sense of resting in the divine strength. I sit on my chair in the dark room and close my eyes, and it is as if I was out of the body, and could feel no want for evermore. For then the very hardship and the sorrow and the blindness and the sin I have beheld and been ready to weep over, yea, all the anguish of the children of men, which sometimes wraps me round like sudden darkness, I can bear with a willing pain, as if I was sharing the Redeemer's cross. For I feel it. Infinite love is suffering too. Yea, in the fullness of knowledge it suffers. It yearns, it mourns, and that is blind self-seeking which wants to be freed from the sorrow wherewith the whole creation groaneth and travaileth. Surely it is not true blessedness to be free from sorrow. While there is sorrow and sin in the world, sorrow is then a part of love, and love does not seek to throw it off. It is not the Spirit only that tells me this. I see it in the whole work and word of the gospel. Is there not pleading in heaven? Is not the man of sorrows there in that crucified body wherewith he ascended? And is he not one with the infinite love itself, as our love is one with our sorrow? These thoughts have been much borne in on me of late, and I have seen with new clearness the meaning of those words, "If any man love me, let him take up my cross." I have heard this enlarged on as if it meant the troubles and persecutions we bring on ourselves by confessing Jesus. But surely that is a narrow thought. The true cross of the Redeemer was the sin and sorrow of this world. That was what lay heavy on his heart, and that is the cross we shall share with him. That is the cup we must drink of with him, if we would have any part in that divine love which is one with his sorrow. In my outward lot which you ask about, I have all things and abound. I have had constant work in the mill, with some of the other hands have been turned off for a time, and my body is greatly strengthened, so that I feel little weariness after long walking and speaking. What you say about staying in your own country with your mother and brother shows me that you have true guidance. Your lot is appointed there by a clear showing, and to seek a greater blessing elsewhere would be like laying a false offering on the altar and expecting the fire from heaven to kindle it. My work and my joy are here among the hills, and I sometimes think I cling too much to my life among the people here, and should be rebellious if I was called away. I was thankful for your tidings about the dear friends at the Hall Farm, for though I sent them a letter by my aunt's desire, after I came back from my sojourn among them, I have had no word from them. My aunt has not the pen of a ready writer, and the work of the house is sufficient for the day, for she is weak in body. My heart cleaves to her and her children as the nearest of all to me in flesh, yea, and to all in that house. I am carried away to them continually in my sleep, and often in the midst of work, and even of speech, the thought of them is borne in on me as if they were in need and trouble, which yet is dark to me. There may be some leading here, but I wait to be taught. You say they are all well. We shall see each other again in the body, I trust, though it may not be for a long while, for the brethren and sisters at Leeds are desirous to have me for a short space among them, when I have a door open me again to leave Snowfield. Farewell, dear brother, and yet not farewell, for those children of God whom it has been granted to see each other face to face, and to hold communion together, and to feel the same Spirit working in both, can never more be sundered, though the hills may lie between. For their souls are enlarged for evermore by that union, and they bear one another about in their thoughts continually, as if it were new strength. Your faithful sister and fellow worker in Christ, Dinah Morris. I have not skill to write the words so small as you do, and my pen moves slow, and so I am straitened and say but little of what is in my mind. Greet your mother for me with a kiss. She asked me to kiss her twice when we parted. Adam had refolded the letter and was sitting meditatively with his head resting on his arm at the head of the bed when Seth came upstairs. "Hast read the letter?" said Seth. "Yes," said Adam. "I don't know what I should ha' thought of her and her letter if I'd never seen her. I dare say I should ha' thought a preaching woman hateful. But she's one as makes everything seem right as she says and does, and I seemed to see her and hear her speaking when I read the letter. It's wonderful how I remember her looks and her voice. She'd make thee rare and happy, Seth. She's just the woman for thee." "It's no use thinking o' that," said Seth despondingly. "She spoke so firm, and she's not the woman to say one thing and mean another. Nay, but her feelings may grow different. A woman may love to get by degrees. The best fire doesna flare up the soonest. I'd have thee go and see her by and by. I'd make it convenient for thee to be away 3 or 4 days, and it 'ud be no walk for thee, only between 20 and 30 mile. I should like to see her again, whether or no, if she wouldna be displeased with me for going," said Seth. "She'll be none displeased," said Adam emphatically, getting up and throwing off his coat. "It might be a great happiness to all if she'd have thee, for mother took to her so wonderful, and seems so contented to be with her." "Aye," said Seth rather timidly, "and Dinah's fond o' Hetty too. She thinks a deal about her." Adam made no reply to that, and no other word but good night passed between them. End of chapter 30. Recording by Laurie Heinrichs. Chapter 31 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laurie Heinrichs. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 31. In Hetty's Bedchamber. It was no longer light enough to go to bed without a candle, even in Mrs. Poyser's early household, and Hetty carried one with her as she went up at last to her bedroom soon after Adam was gone, and bolted the door behind her. Now she would read her letter. It must have comfort in it. How was Adam to know the truth? It was always likely he should say what he did say. She set down the candle and took out the letter. It had a faint scent of roses, which made her feel as if Arthur were close to her. She put it to her lips, and a rush of remembered sensations for a moment or two swept away all fear. But her heart began to flutter strangely, and her hands to tremble as she broke the seal. She read slowly. It was not easy for her to read a gentleman's handwriting, though Arthur had taken pains to write plainly. Dearest Hetty, I have spoken truly when I have said that I loved you, and I shall never forget our love. I shall be your true friend as long as life lasts, and I hope to prove this to you in many ways. If I say anything to pain you in this letter, do not believe it is for want of love and tenderness towards you, for there is nothing I would not do for you, if I knew it to be really for your happiness. I cannot bear to think of my little Hetty shedding tears when I am not there to kiss them away, and if I followed only my own inclinations, I should be with her at this moment instead of writing. It is very hard for me to part from her, harder still for me to write words which may seem unkind, though they spring from the truest kindness. Dear, dear Hetty, sweet as our love has been to me, sweet as it would be to me for you to love me always, I feel that it would have been better for us both if we had never had that happiness, and that it is my duty to ask you to love me and care for me as little as you can. The fault has been all mine, for though I have been unable to resist the longing to be near you, I have felt all the while that your affection for me might cause you grief. I ought to have resisted my feelings. I should have done so if I had been a better fellow than I am. But now, since the past cannot be altered, I am bound to save you from any evil that I have power to prevent. And I feel it would be a great evil for you if your affections continued so fixed on me that you could think of no other man who might be able to make you happier by his love than I ever can, and if you continue to look towards something in the future which cannot possibly happen. For, dear Hetty, if I were to do what you one day spoke of and make you my wife, I should do what you yourself would come to feel was for your misery instead of your welfare. I know you can never be happy except by marrying a man in your own station, and if I were to marry you now, I should only be adding to any wrong I have done, besides offending against my duty in the other relations of life. You know nothing, dear Hetty, of the world in which I must always live, and you would soon begin to dislike me, because there would be so little in which we should be alike. And since I cannot marry you, we must part. We must try not to feel like lovers any more. I am miserable while I say this, but nothing else can be. Be angry with me, my sweet one, I deserve it. But do not believe that I shall not always care for you, always be grateful to you. Always remember my Hetty, and if any troubles should come that we do not now foresee, trust in me to do everything that lies in my power. I have told you where you are to direct the letter to if you want to write, but I put it down below lest you should have forgotten. Do not write unless there is something I can really do for you, for, dear Hetty, we must try to think of each other as little as we can. Forgive me, and try to forget everything about me, except that I shall be, as long as I live, your affectionate friend, Arthur Donnithorne. Slowly Hetty read his letter, and when she looked up from it there was a reflection of a blanched face in the old dim glass. a white marble face with rounded childish forms, but with something sadder than a child's pain in it. Hetty did not see the face. She saw nothing. She only felt that she was cold and sick and trembling. The letter shook and rustled in her hand. She laid it down. It was a horrible sensation, this cold and trembling. It swept away the very ideas that produced it, and Hetty got up to reach a warm cloak from her clothes-press, wrapped it around her, and sat as if she were thinking of nothing but getting warm. Presently she took up the letter with a firmer hand and began to read it through again. The tears came this time, great rushing tears that blinded her and blotched the paper. She felt nothing but that Arthur was cruel to write so, cruel not to marry her. Reasons why he could not marry her had no existence for her mind. How could she believe in any misery that could come to her from the fulfilment of all that she had been longing for and dreaming of? She had not the ideas that could make up the notion of that misery. As she threw down the letter again, she caught sight of her face in the glass. It was reddened now and wet with tears. It was almost like a companion that she might complain to, that would pity her. She leaned forward on her elbows and looked into those dark, overflooding eyes and at the quivering mouth, and saw how the tears came thicker and thicker, and how the mouth became convulsed with sobs. The shattering of all her little dream world, the crushing blow on her newborn passion, afflicted her pleasure-craving nature with an overpowering pain that annihilated all impulse to resistance, and suspended her anger. She sat sobbing till the candle went out, and then, wearied, aching, stupefied with crying, threw herself on the bed without undressing and went to sleep. There was a feeble dawn in the room when Hetty awoke, a little after 4 o'clock, with a sense of dull misery, the cause of which broke upon her gradually as she began to discern the objects around her in the dim light. And then came the frightening thought that she had to conceal her misery as well as to bear it, in this dreary daylight that was coming. She could lie no longer. She got up and went towards the table. There lay the letter. She opened her treasure drawer. There lay the earrings and the locket, the signs of all her short happiness, the signs of the lifelong dreariness that was to follow it. Looking at the little trinkets which she had once eyed and fingered so fondly as the earnest of her future paradise of finery, she lived back in the moments when they had been given to her with such tender caresses, such strangely pretty words, such glowing looks, which filled her with a bewildering, delicious surprise. They were so much sweeter than she had thought anything could be. And the Arthur who had spoken to her and looked at her in this way, who was present with her now, whose arm she felt round her, his cheek against hers, his very breath upon her, was the cruel, cruel Arthur who had written that letter which she snatched and crushed and then opened again, that she might read it once more. The half-benumbed mental condition which was the effect of last night's violent crying made it necessary to her to look again and see if her wretched thoughts were actually true, if the letter was really so cruel. She had to hold it close to the window, else she could not have read it by the faint light. Yes, it was worse, it was more cruel. She crushed it up in anger. She hated the writer of that letter, hated him for the very reason that she hung upon him with all her love, all the girlish passion and vanity that made up her love. She had no tears this morning. She had wept them all away last night, and now she felt that dry-eyed morning misery which is worse than the first shock because it has the future in it as well as the present. Every morning to come, as far as her imagination could stretch, she would have to get up and feel that day would have no joy for her. For there is no despair so absolute as that which comes with the first moments of our first great sorrow, when we have not yet known what it is like to have suffered and be healed, to have despaired and to have recovered hope. As Hetty began languidly to take off the clothes she had worn all night, that she might wash herself and brush her hair, she had a sickening sense that her life would go on in this way. She should always be doing things she had no pleasure in, getting up to the old tasks of work, seeing people she cared nothing about, going church and to Treddleston and to tea with Mrs. Best, and carrying no happy thought with her. For her the short poisonous delights had spoiled for ever the little joys that had once made the sweetness of her life. The new frock ready for Treddleston Fair, the party at Mr. Britton's at Broxton Wake, the beau that she would say no to for a long while, and the prospect of the wedding that was to come at last when she would have a silk gown and a great many clothes all at once. These things were all flat and dreary to her now. Everything would be a weariness, and she would carry about for ever a hopeless thirst and longing. She paused in the midst of her languid undressing and leaned against the dark old clothes-press. Her neck and arms were bare, her hair hung down in delicate rings, and they were just as beautiful as they were that night 2 months ago, when she walked up and down this bedchamber glowing with vanity and hope. She was not thinking of her neck and arms now. Even in her own beauty was indifferent to her. Her eyes wandered sadly over the dull old chamber, and then looked out vacantly towards the growing dawn. Did a remembrance of Dinah come across her mind? Of her foreboding words, which made her angry? Of Dinah's affectionate entreaty to think of her as a friend in trouble? No, the impression had been too slight to recur. Any affection or comfort Dinah could have given her would have been as indifferent to Hetty this morning as everything else was except her bruised passion. She could better bear something quite new than sinking back into the old everyday round. She would like to run away and loose her hold on the familiar and rush blindly on some unknown condition. Hers was a luxurious and vain nature, not a passionate one, and if she were ever to take any violent measure, she would be urged to it by the desperation of terror. There was not much room for her thoughts to travel in the narrow circle of her imagination, and she soon fixed on the one thing that she would do to get away with her old life. She would ask her uncle to let her go to be a lady's maid. Miss Lydia's maid would help her to get a situation, if she knew Hetty had her uncle's leave. When she had thought of this, she fastened up her hair and began to wash. It seemed more possible to her to go downstairs and try to behave as usual. She would ask her uncle this very day. On Hetty's blooming health it would take a great deal of such mental suffering as hers to leave any deep impress, and when she was dressed as neatly as usual in her working dress, with her hair tucked up under her little cap, an indifferent observer would have been more struck with the young roundness of her cheek and neck and the darkness of her eyes and eyelashes than with any signs of sadness about her. But when she took up the crushed letter and put it in her drawer, that she might lock it out of sight, hard smarting tears, having no relief in them as the great drops had that fell last night, forced their way into her eyes. She wiped them away quickly. She must not cry in the daytime. Nobody should find out how miserable she was. Nobody should know she was disappointed about anything, and the thought that the eyes of her aunt and uncle should be upon her gave her the self-command which often accompanies a great dread. For Hetty looked out from her secret misery towards the possibility of their eyes knowing what had happened, as the sick and weary prisoner might think of the possible pillory. They would think her conduct shameful, and shame was torture. That was poor little Hetty's conscience. So she locked up her drawer and went away to her early work. In the evening, when Mr. Poyser was smoking his pipe, and his good nature was therefore at its superlative moment, Hetty seized the opportunity of her aunt's absence to say, "Uncle, I wish you'd let me go for a lady's maid." Mr. Poyser took the pipe from his mouth and looked at Hetty in mild surprise for some moments. She was sewing and went on with her work industriously. "Why, what's put that into your head, my wench?" he said at last, after he had given one conservative puff. "I should like it. I should like it better than farm work." "Nay, nay, you fancy so because you dinna know it, my wench. It wouldn't be half so good for your health, nor for your luck o' life. I'd like you to stay wi' us until you got a good husband. You're my own niece, and I wouldn't have you go to service, though it's a gentleman's house, as long as I've got a home for you." Mr. Poyser paused and puffed away at his pipe. "I like the needlework," said Hetty. "I should get good wages." "Has your aunt been a bit sharp wi' you?" said Mr. Poyser, not noticing Hetty's further argument. "You mustna mind that, my wench. She does it for your good. She wishes you well, and there isn't many aunts as are no kin to you 'ud ha' done by you as she has." "No, it isn't my aunt," said Hetty, "but I should like the work better." "It was all very well for you to learn the work a bit, and I gev my consent to that fast enough, sin' Mr. Pomfret was willing to teach you. For if anything was to happen, it's well to know how to turn your hand to different sorts o' things. But I never meant you to go to service, my wench. My family's ate their own bread and cheese as fur back as anybody knows, hanna they, father? You wouldna like your grandchild to take wage?" "Nay," said old Martin, with an elongation of the word, meant to make it bitter as well as negative, while he leaned forward and looked down on the floor. "But the wench takes arter her mother. I had hard work to hold her in here, and she married a spite o' me, a fellow wi' only 2 head o' stock when there should ha' been on's farm. She might well die o' the inflammation afore she was 30. It was seldom the old man made so long a speech, but his son's question had fallen like a bit of dry fuel on the embers of a long unextinguished resentment. which had always made the grandfather more indifferent to Hetty than to his son's children. Her mother's fortune had been spent by that good-for-naught Sorrel, and Hetty had Sorrel's blood in her veins. Poor thing," said Martin the younger, who was sorry to have provoked the retrospective harshness. "She had but bad luck, but Hetty's got as good a chance of getting a solid, sober husband as any gal of this country." After throwing out this pregnant hint, Mr. Poyser recurred to his pipe in silence, looking at Hetty to see if she did not give some sign of having renounced her ill-advised wish. But instead of that, Hetty, in spite of herself, began to cry, half out of ill temper at the denial, half out of the day's repressed sadness. "Hey," said Mr. Poyser, meaning to check her playfully. "Don't let's have any crying. Crying's for them as ha' got no home, not for them as want to get rid o' one. What dost think?" he continued to his wife, who now came back into the house-place, knitting with fierce rapidity, as if that movement were a necessary function, like the twittering of a crab's antenna. "Think? Why, I think we shall have the fowl stole before we are much older, with that gal forgetting to lock the pens up o' nights. What's the matter now, Hetty? What are you crying at?" "Why, she's been wanting to go for a lady's maid," said Mr. Poyser. "I tell her we can do better for her than that." "I thought she'd got some maggot in her head. She's gone about with her mouth buttons up so all day. That's all but going so among them servants at the Chase, as we war fools for letting her go. She thinks it'd be a finer life than being with them as are kin to her and have brought her up since she war no bigger nor Marty. She thinks there's nothing belongs to being a lady's maid but wearing finer clothes nor she was born to, I'll be bound. It's what rags she can get to stick on her as she's thinking on from morning till night, as I often ask her if she wouldn't like to be the mawkin in the field, for then she'd be made o' rags inside and out. I'll never give my consent to her going for a lady's maid while she's got good friends to take care on her till she's married to somebody who's better nor one of them valets, as is neither a common man nor a gentleman, and must live on the fat of the land, and's like enough to stick his hands under his coat-tails and expect his wife to work for him." Aye," said Mr. Poyser, "we must have a better husband for her nor that, and there's better at hand. Come, my wench, give over crying and get to bed. I'll do better for you nor letting you go for a lady's maid. Let's hear no more on't." When Hetty was gone upstairs, he said, "I canna make it out as she would want to go away, for I thought she'd got a mind to Adam Bede. She's looked like it o' late." There's no knowing what she's got a liking to, for things take no more hold on her than if she was a dried pea. I believe that gell, Molly, as is aggravating enough for the matter o' that, but I believe she'd care more about leaving us and the children, for all she's been here but a year come Michaelmas, nor Hetty would. But she's got this notion o' being a lady's maid with going among them servants. We might ha' known that it 'ud lead to when we let her go to learn the fine work, but I'll put a stop to it pretty quick." "Thee'dst be sorry to part wi' her, if it wasn't for her good," said Mr. Poyser. "She's useful to thee i' the work." "Sorry? Yes, I'm fonder on her nor she deserves. A little hard-hearted hussy wanting to leave us i' that way. I can't ha' had her about me these 7 years, I reckon, and done for her, and taught her everything, without caring about her. And here I'm having linen spun, and thinking all the while it'll make sheeting and table-clothing for her when she's married, and she'll live i' the parish wi' us, and never go out of our sights, like a fool as I am for thinking aught about her as is no better nor a cherry wi' a hard stone inside it." Nay, thee mustna make much of a trifle," said Mr. Poyser soothingly. "She's fond on us, I'll be bound, but she's young, and gets things in her head as she can't rightly give account on. Them young fillies 'ull run away often without knowing why." Her uncle's answers, however, had another effect on Hetty besides that of disappointing her and making her cry. She knew quite well whom he had in his mind in his allusions to marriage and to a sober, solid husband, and when she was in her bedroom again, the possibility of her marrying Adam presented itself to her in a new light. In a mind where no strong sympathies are at work, where there is no supreme sense of right to which the agitated nature can cling and steady itself to quiet endurance, one of the first results of sorrow is a desperate, vague clutching after any deed that will change the actual condition. Poor Hetty's vision of consequences, at no more time than a narrow, fantastic calculation of her own probable pleasures and pains, was now quite shut out by reckless irritation under present suffering, and she was ready for one of those convulsive, motiveless actions by which wretched men and women leap from a temporary sorrow into a lifelong misery. Why should she not marry Adam? She did not care what she did so that it made some change in her life. She felt confident that he would still want to marry her, and any further thought about Adam's happiness in the matter had never yet visited her. Strange, perhaps you will say, this rush of impulse towards a course that might have seemed the most repugnant to her present state of mind, and in only the second night of her sadness. Yes, the actions of a little trivial soul like Hetty, struggling amidst the serious, sad destinies of a human being, are strange. So are the motions of a little vessel without ballast tossed about on a stormy sea. How pretty it looked with its party-coloured sail in the sunlight, moored in the quiet bay. Let that man bear the loss who loosed it from its moorings. But that will not save the vessel, the pretty thing that might have been a lasting joy. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 31 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Millward. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 32. Mrs. Poyser has her say out. The next Saturday evening there was much excited discussion at the Donnithorne Arms concerning an incident which had occurred that very day, no less than a second appearance of the smart man in top boots, said by some to be a mere farmer in treaty for the Chase farm, by others to be the future steward, but by Mr. Casson himself, the personal witness to the stranger's visit, pronounced contemptuously to be nothing better than a bailiff such as Satchell had been before him. No one had thought of denying Mr. Casson's testimony to the fact that he had seen the stranger. Nevertheless, he proffered various corroborating circumstances. "I see him myself," he said. "I see him coming along by the Crabtree meadow on a bald-faced hoss. I'd just been to have a pint. It was after 10 in the forenoon, when I have my pint as regular as the clock, and I says to Knowles, as druv up with his wagon, 'You'll get a bit of barley to-day, Knowles,' I says, 'if you look about you.' And then I went round by the rickyard and toward the Treddles on road, and just as I come up by the big ash tree, I see the man in top boots coming along on a bald-faced hoss. I wish I may never stir if I didn't. And I stood still till he come up, and I says, 'Good morning, sir,' I says, for I wanted to hear the turn of his tongue, as I might know whether he was this countryman. So I says, 'Good morning, sir. It'll hup for the barley this morning, I think. There'll be a bit got him, if we've good luck.' And he says, 'You may be right. There's no telling,' he says. And I knowed by that," here Mr. Casson gives a wink, "as he didn't come from 100 mile off. I dare say he'd think me a hard talker, as you Loamshire folks allus does hany one as talks the right language." "The right language," said Bartle Massey contemptuously. "You're about as near the right language as a pig squeaking is like a tune played on a key-bugle." "Well, I don't know," answered Mr. Casson with an angry smile. "I should think a man as has lived among the gentry from a by, it's likely to know what's the right answer pretty nigh as well as a schoolmaster." "Aye, aye, man," said Bartle with a tone of sarcastic consolation. "You talk the right language for you. When Mike Holdsworth's goat says 'Bah!' it's all right. It'd be unnatural for it to make any other noise." The rest of the party being Loamshire men, Mr. Casson had the laugh strongly against him, and wisely fell back on the previous question, which, far from being exhausted in a single evening, was renewed in the churchyard before service the next day, with the fresh interest conferred on all news when there is a fresh person to hear it. And that fresh hearer was Martin Poyser, who, as his wife said, never went boozing with that set at Casson's, a-sitting a-soaking in drink, and looking as wise as a lot of codfish with red faces. It was probably owing to the conversation she had with her husband on their way from church concerning this problematic stranger that Mrs. Poyser's thoughts immediately reverted to him when, a day or two afterwards, as she was standing at the house door with her knitting, in that eager leisure which came to her when the afternoon cleaning was done, she saw the old squire enter the yard on his black pony, followed by John the groom. She always cited it afterwards as a case of prevision, which really had something more in it than her own remarkable penetration, that the moment she set eyes on the squire, she said to herself, "I shouldn't wonder if he's come about that man as is a-going to take the Chase farm, wanting Poyser to do something for him without pay. But Poyser's a fool if he does." Something unwonted must clearly be in the wind, for the old squire's visits to his tenantry were rare, and though Mrs. Poyser had during the last 12-month recited many imaginary speeches, meaning even more than met the ear, which she was quite determined to make to him the next he appeared within the gates of the Hall Farm, the speeches had always remained imaginary. "Good day, Mrs. Poyser," said the old squire, peering at her with his short-sighted eyes, a mode of looking at her which, as Mrs. Poyser observed, "allays aggravated me. It was as if you was an insect, and he was going to dab his finger-nail on you." However, she said, "Your servant, sir," and curtsied with an air of perfect deference as she advanced toward him. She was not the woman to misbehave toward her betters, and fly in the face of the catechism without severe provocation. "Is your husband at home, Mrs. Poyser?" "Yes, sir. He's only in the rick-yard. I'll send for him in a minute. If you'll please to get down and step in." "Thank you, I will do so. I want to consult him about a little matter, but you are quite as much concerned in it, if not more. I must have your opinion too." "Hetty, run and tell your uncle to come in," said Mrs. Poyser as they entered the house, and the old gentleman bowed low in answer to Hetty's curtsy, while Totty, conscious of a pinafore stained with gooseberry jam, stood hiding her face against the clock and peeping round furtively. "What a fine old kitchen this is," said Mr. Donnithorne, looking round admiringly. He always spoke in the same deliberate, well-chiselled, polite way, whether his words were sugary or venomous. "And you keep it so exquisitely clean, Mrs. Poyser. I like these premises, do you know, beyond any on the estate." "Well, sir, since you're fond of 'em, I should be glad if you'd let a bit of repairs be done to 'em, for the boarding's in that state as were like to be eaten up with rats and mice, and the cellar, you may stand up to your knee in water in it if you like to go down, but perhaps you'd rather believe my words. Won't you please sit down, sir?" "Not yet. I must see your dairy. I've not seen it for years, and I hear on all hands about your fine cheese and butter," said the squire, looking politely unconscious that there could be any question on which he and Mrs. Poyser might happen to disagree. "I think I see the door open there. You must not be surprised if I cast a covetous eye on your cream and butter. I don't expect that Mrs. Satchel's cream and butter will bear comparison with yours." "I can't say, sir, I'm sure. It's seldom I see other folks' butter, though there's some on it as one's no need to see. The smell's enough." "Ah, now, this I like," said Mr. Donnithorne, looking round at the damp temple of cleanliness, but keeping near the door. "I'm sure I should like my breakfast better if I knew the butter and cream came from this dairy. Thank you, that really is a pleasant sight. Unfortunately, my slight tendency to rheumatism makes me afraid of damp. I'll sit down in your comfortable kitchen." "Ah, Poyser, how do you do? In the midst of business, I see, as usual. I've been looking at your wife's beautiful dairy. The best manager in the parish, is she not?" Mr. Poyser had just entered in shirt-sleeves and open waistcoat, with a face a shade redder than usual from the exertion of pitching. As he stood, red, rotund, and radiant, before the small, wiry, cool old gentleman, he looked like a prize apple by the side of a withered crab. "Will you please to take this chair, sir?" he said, lifting his father's armchair forward a little. "You'll find it easy." "No, thank you. I never sit in easy chairs," said the old gentleman, seating himself on a small chair near the door. "Do you know, Mrs. Poyser? Sit down, pray, both of you. I've been far from contented for some time with Mrs. Satchel's dairy management. I think she has not a good method, as you have." "Indeed, sir, I can't speak to that," said Mrs. Poyser in a hard voice, rolling and unrolling her knitting and looking icily out of the window as she continued to stand opposite the squire. Poyser might sit down if he liked, she thought. She wasn't going to sit down, as if she'd give in to any such smooth-tongued palaver. Mr. Poyser, who looked and felt the reverse of icy, did sit down in his three-cornered chair. "And now, Poyser, as Satchel is laid up, I am intending to let the Chase farm to a respectable tenant. I'm tired of having a farm on my own hands. Nothing is made the best of in such cases, as you know. A satisfactory bailiff is hard to find, and I think you and I, Poyser, and your excellent wife here, can enter into a little arrangement in consequence, which will be to our mutual advantage." "Oh," said Mr. Poyser, with a good-natured blankness of imagination as to the nature of the arrangement. "If I'm called upon to speak, sir," said Mrs. Poyser, after glancing at her husband with pity at his softness, "you know better than me, but I don't see what the Chase farm is to us. We've cumber enough with our own farm. Not but what I'm glad to hear o' anybody respectable coming into the parish. There's some as have been brought in as hadn't been looked on in that character." "You're likely to find Mr. Thurle an excellent neighbour, I assure you, such a one as you will feel glad to have accommodated by the little plan I'm going to mention, especially as I hope you will find it as much to your own advantage as his." "Indeed, sir, if it's anything to our advantage, it'll be the first offer of the sort I've heard on. It's them as takes advantage that get advantage in this world, I think. Folks have to wait long enough afore it's brought to 'em." "The fact is, Poyser," said the squire, ignoring Mrs. Poyser's theory of worldly prosperity, "there is too much dairy land and too little plough land on the Chase farm to suit Thurle's purpose. Indeed, he will only take the farm on condition of some change in it. His wife, it appears, is not a clever dairywoman like yours. Now, the plan I'm thinking of is to effect a little exchange. If you were to have the hollow pastures, you might increase your dairy, which must be so profitable under your wife's management. And I should request you, Mrs. Poyser, to supply my house with milk, cream, and butter at the market prices. On the other hand, Poyser, you might let Thurle have the lower and upper ridges, which really, with our wet seasons, would be a good riddance for you. There is much less risk in dairy land than corn land." Mr. Poyser was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his head on one side, and his mouth screwed up, apparently absorbed in making the tips of his fingers meet so as to represent with perfect accuracy the ribs of a ship. He was much too acute a man not to see through the whole business and to foresee perfectly what would be his wife's view of the subject. But he disliked giving unpleasant answers. Unless it was on a point of farming practice, he would rather give up than have a quarrel any day, and, after all, it mattered more to his wife than to him. So, after a few moments' silence, he looked up at her and said mildly, "What dost say?" Mrs. Poyser had had her eyes fixed on her husband with cold severity during his silence, but now she turned away her head with a toss, looked icily at the opposite roof of the cowshed, and, spearing her knitting together with the loose pin, held it firmly between her clasped hands. "Say? Why, I say you may do as you like about giving up any o' your corn land afore your lease is up, which it won't be for a year come next Michaelmas. But I'll not consent to take more dairy work into my hands either for love or money, and there's neither love nor money here as I can see, only other folks' love o' theirselves, and the money as is to go into other folks' pockets. I know there's them as is born to own the land, and them as is born to sweat on it." Here Mrs. Poyser paused to gasp a little. "And I know it's christened folks' duty to submit to their betters, as fur as flesh and blood 'ull bear it. But I'll not make a martyr o' myself, and wear myself to skin and bone, and worrit myself as if I was a churn with butter a-coming in it, for no landlord in England, not if he was King George himself." "No, no, my dear Mrs. Poyser, certainly not," said the squire, still confident in his own powers of persuasion. "You must not overwork yourself. But don't you think your work will rather be lessened than increased in this way? There is so much milk required at the Abbey that you will have little increase of cheese and butter making for the addition to your dairy. And I believe selling the milk is the most profitable way of disposing of dairy produce. Is it not?" "Aye, that's true," said Mr. Poyser, unable to repress an opinion on a question of farming profits, and forgetting that it was not in this case a purely abstract question. "I dare say," said Mrs. Poyser bitterly, turning her head halfway towards her husband and looking at the vacant armchair. "I dare say it's true for men as sit in the chimney corner and make believe as everything's cut with ins and outs to fit in everything else. If you could make a pudding with thinking of the batter, it'd be easy getting dinner. How do I know whether the milk will be wanted constant? What's to make me sure as the house won't be put a board wage afore we're many months older, and then I may have to lie here awake o' nights with 20 gallons of milk on my mind, and Dingle'll take no more butter, let alone paying for it, and we must fat pigs till we're obliged to beg the butcher on our knees to buy them, and lose half of 'em with the measles. And there's the fetching and the carrying, as 'ud be welly half a day's work for a man and hoss. That's to be took out of the profits, I reckon. But there's folks that hold a sieve under the pump and expect to carry away with the water. That difficulty about the fetching and carrying you will not have, Mrs. Poyser," said the squire, who thought that this entrance into particulars indicated a distant inclination to compromise on Mrs. Poyser's part. "Bethel will do that regularly with the cart and pony." "Oh, sir, begging your pardon, I've never been used to having gentlefolks' servants coming about my back places, a-making love to both the girls at the once, and keeping 'em with their hands on their hips listening to all the manner of gossip, when they should be down on their knees a-scouring. If we're to go to ruin, it shanna be with having our back kitchen turned into a public." "Well, Poyser," said the squire, shifting his tactics and looking as if he thought Mrs. Poyser had suddenly withdrawn from the proceedings and left the room, "you can turn the hollows into feeding land. I can easily make another arrangement about supplying my house. And I shall not forget your readiness to accommodate your landlord as well as a neighbour. I know you will be glad to have your lease renewed for 3 years, when the present one expires. Otherwise, I dare say Thurl, who is a man of some capital, would be glad to take both the farms, as they could be worked so well together. But I don't want to part with an old tenant like you." To be thrust out of the discussion in this way would have been enough to complete Mrs. Poyser's exasperation, even without the final threat. Her husband, really alarmed at the possibility of their leaving the old place where he had been bred and born, for he believed the old squire had small spite enough for anything, was beginning a mild remonstrance explanatory of the inconvenience he should find in having to buy and sell more stock, with "Well, sir, I think it's rather hard," when Mrs. Poyser burst in with a desperate determination to have her say out this once, though it were to rain notices to quit, and the only shelter were the workhouse. "Then, sir, if I may speak, as, for all I'm a woman, and there's folks as think a woman's fool enough to stand by and look on while the men sign her soul away, I've a right to speak, for I make 1/4 of the rent, and save another 1/4. I say, if Mr. Turl's so ready to take the farm under you, it's a pity but what he should take this, and see if he likes to live in a house with all the plagues of Egypt in it, with the cellar full of water and frogs, and toads hopping up the steps by dozens, and the floors rotten, and the rats and mice gnawing every bit of cheese and running over our heads as we lie abed, till we expect 'em to eat us up alive, as it's a mercy they hanna eat the children long ago. I should like to see if there's another tenant besides Poyser as 'd put up with never having a bit of repairs done till the place tumbles down, and not then, only with begging and praying and having to pay half, and being strung up with the rent, as it's much if he gets enough out of the land to pay, for all he's put his own money into the ground beforehand. See, if you'll get a stranger to lead such a life here as that, a maggot must be born in the rotten cheese to like it, I reckon. You may run away from the words, sir," continued Mrs. Poyser, following the old squire beyond the door, for after the first moments of stunned surprise he had got up, and waving his hand towards her with a smile, had walked out towards his pony. But it was impossible for him to get away immediately, for John was walking the pony up and down the yard, and was some distance from the causeway when his master beckoned. "You may run away from my words, sir, and you may go spinning underhanded ways of doing us a mischief, for you've got old Harry to your friend, though nobody else is. But I tell you for once as we're not dumb creatures to be abused and made money on by them as has got the lash in their hands, for want o' knowing how to undo the tackle. And if I'm the one as speaks my mind, there's plenty of the same way of thinking in this parish, and the next to it, for your name's no better than a brimstone match in everybody's nose. If it isn't 2-3 old folks as you think of saving your soul by giving 'em a bit of flannel and a drop of porridge. And you may be right in thinking it'll take but little to save your soul, for it'll be the smallest saving you've ever made, with all your scraping." There are occasions on which 2 servant girls and a waggoner may be a formidable audience, and as the squire rode away on his black pony, even the gift of a short-sightedness did not prevent him from being aware that Molly and Nancy and Tim were grinning not far from him. Perhaps he suspected that sour old John was grinning behind him, which was also the fact. Meanwhile, the bulldog, the black and tan terrier, Alec's sheepdog, and the gander hissing at a safe distance from the pony's heels carried out the idea of Mrs. Poyser's solo in an impressive quartet. Mrs. Poyser, however, had no sooner seen the pony move off than she turned round, gave the 2 hilarious damsels a look which drove them into the back kitchen, and, unsparing her knitting, began to knit again with her usual rapidity as she re-entered the house. "Thee'st done it now," said Mr. Poyser, a little alarmed and uneasy, but not without some triumphant amusement at his wife's outbreak. "Yes, I know I've done it," said Mrs. Poyser, "but I've had my say out, and I shall be the easier for it all my life. There's no pleasure in living if you're to be corked up for ever, and only dribble your mind out by the sly, like a leaky barrel. I shan't repent saying what I think if I live to be as old as the old squire, and there's little likelihood, for it seems as if them as aren't wanted here are the only folks as aren't wanted in the other world. But thee wouldna like moving from the old place this Michaelmas 12-month," said Mr. Poyser, "and going into a strange parish where thee knowest nobody. It'll be hard upon us both, and upon father too." It's no use worriting. There's plenty of things may happen between this and Michaelmas 12-month. The captain may be master afore them, for what we know," said Mrs. Poyser, inclined to take an unusually hopeful view of an embarrassment which had been brought about by her own merit and not by other people's fault. "I'm none for worriting," said Mr. Poyser, rising from his 3-cornered chair and walking slowly towards the door. "But I should be loath to leave the old place, and the parish where I was bred and born, and father afore me. We should have leave our roots behind us, I doubt, and never thrive again." End of chapter 32.